Hello and welcome to the next in the series of bloggingheads.tv devalogues on the current upheavals in the Arab world. I am Gregory Gause. I am the chair of the political science department at the University of Vermont, and with me today is one of my favorite people in the world, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Jillian Schwedler. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, and I'm author of Faith in Moderation. I get to plug my book. And I'm talking to one of my favorite people in the world, although we often disagree on things.
Yes, just because we like each other doesn't mean we always agree about the Middle East, as you are about to see. So let's start right off, Jillian, with the topic of is it over? Is the Arab Spring done? And I don't mean done in the sense that, tomorrow everyone in Syria is going to go home and everyone in Yemen is going to go home and everything will be fine there, but done in the sense that there are no more cases in the Arab world where, at least in the immediate term, we're going to see major regime crises and major upheavals. Do you think it's done?
No, absolutely not. I don't think it's done at all. In fact, I think everything is on the table right now. I think the regimes that are responding, and Morocco and Jordan, the announcements 2 weeks ago now to open up a little bit, are because the monarchs are starting to look around and they're panicking a bit. They realize that things could still be happening. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of the countries where we've seen revolutions is also that it's not done. In Egypt, for example, you have the labor and the youth are continuing to insist that the transition that's happening isn't nearly enough for what they want. So I think absolutely not. It's a mistake to think we're done here.
I think that we're not done in terms of the cases that you mentioned where we've had upheaval and the removal of presidents like Egypt and Tunisia. Things are still percolating there. Although I think that the Tahrirists, the youth, the people that Americans like, and the people that get on the news, the English language news, I think that they're headed for losses, both tactically and strategically in the near term. We can talk about that in a minute. But I actually think that the contagion effect, the diffusion effect of the Arab Spring is done. And I think that there have been a couple of dams that have held it back. One of those dams is oil. The only oil state that has had serious upheaval is Libya. And that does show that it's not just having oil money, it's spending it in ways that aren't stupid, means something. But if you look at the oil states, they've been able to hold this off, including Algeria.
Go ahead.
Including Algeria. So the places where it might spread would be non-oil states. You mentioned Morocco and Jordan. But it seems to me that the monarchies in both those countries have taken enough steps to head off big-time upheaval.
Do you think it has anything to do with oil, though? I mean, that's the obvious, indicator for a lot of those cases. But if we look at the place in the Gulf where we've seen the most protests, in Bahrain, there's a strong sectarian divide. You have a disenfranchised population. In a place like Qatar, okay, we haven't seen anything, but you have a population of, a very small population, hundreds of thousands, who are generally educated, generally well off. I mean, maybe it's nothing to do with oil. Maybe it has, don't have this massive unemployed population that's been systematically disenfranchised. The disenfranchised in the Gulf aren't citizens. And so, I mean, that's perhaps the reason why we haven't seen these explode in the Gulf.
I think that Qatar and the UAE are never going to see any upheavals.
I agree, but I don't think it's because of oil, or do you think it's because they just have you exclude everyone from citizenship and they're basically educated and not disenfranchised?
Right, and I think that that's absolutely true in the very weird cases of Qatar and the UAE. But let's compare to Bahrain to Saudi, where I do think oil is the difference, because look at Bahrain, a place that has had serious upheavals, right? It has a per capita income that's higher than the Saudi per capita income. But I think the difference is, aside from the sectarianism, although, of course, there's sectarian tensions in Saudi, but they don't cut the same way. It's not a minority government with a majority population. It's a majority government and a minority group, the Shia in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. But I think the difference between Bahrain and Saudi in the way they could handle this is not the repressive apparatus. They both have that, that's for sure. I think that the difference really is that the Saudis had ready cash. And when things got dicey after Tunisia and Egypt, and it looked like things were going to spread, and they did start to spread, Yemen, Bahrain, right? The Saudis could deploy an enormous amount of ready cash to supplement the coercive apparatus to keep people from protesting.
Okay,
In
but
Bahrain,
maybe it's shutting down the kind of massive protests, the sort of Tahrir style occupation that's calling for the regime to step down. But you're seeing in Saudi Arabia, I mean, you might not want to call it a revolution, but isn't there a lot of pushback from women and others that are insisting to be heard differently? And I don't know how that's not connected to the pushback that's happening elsewhere in the region.
Oh, it's definitely connected. There's been petition movements, and we in the West have focused on the women's driving issue, which I actually think is great for the regime in Saudi Arabia, because the women's driving issue, and we saw the last round of women driving, it wasn't even 100 women.
Right.
It divides groups that might actually have common cause against the regime, right? So you get the Islamists, the Salafi Islamists, many of whom are coming around to the idea that there should be some kind of accountability for this regime, maybe even elections. You've seen some prominent Salafis in Saudi Arabia, like Salman al-Auda, calling for elections to an elected parliament, which is a big change for the Saudi Salafi Islamists.
Absolutely.
Right. And you see the liberals, right, who put out their petitions just like they did in the 90s, just like they did after 9/11, calling for an elected legislature. So there's some common ground there. But when you get the women's driving issue and women's issues in general, you just divide them, right? They're on different sides of that issue, and I don't know if I wouldn't go so far as to say the regime encouraged or planned this concentration on the women driving in Saudi recently, but it certainly served their purposes.
Yeah, and it certainly plays in the West, where our deep concern is, the women are oppressed. And of course,
Yeah.
a lot of that is, absolutely true. And I don't mean to disparage that. But I think there's ways to think about revolution that don't just, the sort of Tahrir style revolution, was exciting. And Tunisia as well. They were exciting. They were fast. They took regimes down. We were very excited by that. But one of those things that seems to be happening in both those cases is sort of economic reform is off the table. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking in Saudi Arabia. Is there this sort of the regime allowing or channeling, obviously economic reforms off the table, political reform seems off the table, allowing things like this, these sort of visible, women driving, great photo ops, et cetera, to allow something to change in that regard as a way of trying to deflate. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, do you see it as a regime strategy to do this vis-a-vis the women, to allow it vis-a-vis the women, or they just don't have control of it, and as a side fact, it happens to help the regime by dividing other opposition?
Well, they're certainly allowing it because they could have arrested these women, and they did arrest some of them at the beginning when the call for the driving, the day of driving, basically came out. They arrested a couple of the activists, but it's interesting to note that, as far as I can tell, nobody got arrested for driving that day.
Right.
Some people were cited. They got their traffic tickets, or they were taken down to the police station, but nobody's in jail because they drove that day. And so it's interesting. Maybe this is a place the regime is willing to do a little give, but I think it's more beneficial to the regime as a wedge issue, as a divisive issue among groups that might find common ground on other things that the regime doesn't like.
Is it possible that there's more happening in Saudi Arabia that we're just not hearing about? Because, there have been protests. They've been, relatively limited,
Yeah.
Sometimes dismissed as happening only in a certain part of the country. But, we have such open access and visibility of places like Egypt. And, is it possible that there's more happening? Or is the possibility just to sort of control information off the table, even for a country like Saudi Arabia?
I think the Saudis can certainly do it better than even the Syrians can, because, you got Lebanon right on the border of Syria and all those connections. And so even though the Syrian regime wants to close down the information window, it's harder to do it because, the stuff, people call people in Lebanon, and Lebanon's wide open on that. But I do think that it's harder even in Saudi to hide things. I mean, there's Facebook, there's YouTube, there's all these things that we talk about all the time now as changing politics. I don't know how much they've changed politics, but I am willing to to concede that they've changed it somewhat. So I think that, it would be a mistake to say there's nothing going on in Saudi. It'd be a mistake to say there's nothing going on in Qatar or the UAE for that matter. But it certainly doesn't rise to the level of what we've seen in other places.
And you're convinced that we're over the crest, that it's basically going to, we're going to have these conflicts that some are going to go on. Yemen and Libya may well go on. Syria may well go on for a while. But you don't think we're going to see a major upheaval in another case?
I don't think so right now. I don't think so.
I hope to see you back on Blogging Heads, and we can discuss that when it happens.
Right. And I've been wrong before, and on Blogging Heads I've been wrong. And the difference between me and most people in Washington is I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong.
That's true, and I appreciate that.
So let's go on to the places where there have been these big upheavals, and look and check back into Egypt and Tunisia and maybe Yemen, a place where you've done a lot of field work. Do you think that there are the prospects for democracy in these places? I mean, just to tee this up a little, we already see...
Absolutely. I mean, the question is whether we'll get to that, but there's absolutely prospects for democracy. You have, the sort of entrenched, economically in particular, I think haven't got as much attention as they should. We're all focused on the sort of the particularities of the structural changes at the level of the state. What is the electoral system going to look like? Are the elections going to be soon? How is the Constitution going to be amended? What parties are going to emerge? And all those are crucial questions. But by focusing on those questions, what we miss is the fact that economically you're not really going to see, or it seems it's possible that we might not see a fundamental change in class relations, in economic distribution, in relations with the regime, and wealth in those countries to external wealth. And I think that's unfortunate that we're not going to see those kinds of changes. However, if we do see those if those changes are off the table, at least temporarily, and I'm sad that they seem to be off the table. I hope they're back on the table. But say in Tunisia and Egypt, if economic reform is substantially off the table, then I think it's in a lot of people's interest to sort of push the democratic project and actually, as long as those two can be separated, it's in the economics elite to keep everyone else distracted with elections, allow them to have, substantially more freedom. Are we going to see Western-style democracies? Well, I mean, you and I both never thought we would actually see that. But that doesn't mean there'll be lesser democracies. I mean, why can't we, I don't see it's unrealistic to expect some kind of substantial, accountable, represented, through elections, probably representative governments that emerge in these countries. But particularly if the economic change is off the table, there'll be few reasons for the elites to stand in and disrupt the process. I just think that the region has changed in ways that there's no going back. And I think it's a question of whether we're going to see democratic regimes emerging in the next year or it's going to take 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I actually have a different take on the relationship between the economic issue and the political issue, the political democracy issue. Because it seems to me that if you are going to have elections, and we're certainly going to have elections in Tunisia, right? Mm-hmm. And we're going to have elections in Egypt of some kind or another. The other places, who knows? But if you're going to have real elections in these places, you can't keep the economic issue off the table, right? Because in both Tunisia and Egypt, we've seen, with the quote-unquote success of the Washington consensus policies in these places, we've seen increasing inequalities, as you pointed out. But it seems to me that if you're going to have free elections, people are going to vote those interests. And there are going to be political entrepreneurs that will try to mobilize people along those economic lines. And maybe there'll be Islamists and maybe there'll be leftists, or maybe the Islamists and leftists will get together. Who knows? But it seems to me that if you have free elections, you can't but address those issues of economic policy and will these states continue on the economic path that they're on now? And thus it seems to me that there's where you get the incentives for the people who have benefited under Ben Ali and Mubarak. And maybe the Egyptian military too, right? That has a bigger economic stake in the system that most people appreciate. Mm-hmm. To try to step in and stop the democratic process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the point that I'm trying to make is economic issues are not being discussed right now. You have people, labor and a lot of the youth groups in Egypt, for example, We were both just there. They're out there, they're pressing, those issues, they're demanding, they want to be paid, they want changes in wages, and there's, little tiny tinkerings happening around the margin. But now that they're being portrayed as, the thugs, they're not getting behind the revolution as they really should while we all focus on elections. And so, yes, you can't entirely, push the electoral issues aside, or the economic issues aside. And I think that's true. But I think what's unfortunate that's happening is they're being bracketed, in ways like, they remind me sadly of the 60s and Sam Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies, where his core argument was, well, for the sake of stability and economic development, we're going to have to bracket some of these reforms,
Right.
For the time being and push forward with economic reforms. It seems to me we're almost seeing the inverse. It's like, well, for the sake of democracy, we're going to have to bracket economic changes because the country, quite frankly, is going to have to get up and running. We're not talking about redistribution of income. We're not talking about land reform. It's completely off the table. And I think a lot of the elites that are behind the revolutions right now, because everybody wants to get on the right side of that narrative, a lot of the elites that are behind the revolution right now are behind them because they feel confident that they're going to still have their contracts and their land holdings are going to be in place.
Yeah. I wonder though if they have real elections, if they can be certain of that, because we know that the people who went into Tahrir were motivated by many different things.
Exactly.
But one of the things they were motivated by was this sense of economic inequality, the sense that the benefits to economic change in Tunisia, in Egypt, were being reserved for a very, very small slice. Now, sometimes that gets expressed in terms of corruption, right? The family is corrupt. The Ben Ali family is corrupt. The Mubarak family is corrupt. But the next step to that is that, even the people who played by the rules and weren't stealing money, right? We know that when you get the beginnings of these economic liberalizations, you get a lot of capital concentration, and people get rich. And it seems to me that once the Mubaraks and the Ben Alis are gone, the next logical step in democratic politics, if I'm a political entrepreneur who wants to get a lot of votes and who feels he represents the common people, I start pointing at those people and saying, why are they rich and us and you are poor? And
Absolutely,
we need to change this.
But it's all going to happen within the same sort of neoliberal, economic framework. Everybody's going to want a piece of that pie. There's going to be no discussion of let's break down these massive holdings and, give farmable land to, Egyptians so that they can actually, make it a food that they can sustain themselves. I mean, that's going to be off the table. I think they'll want to debate, the economic issues, but it's all going to be within the framework of, I want my little entrepreneurial opportunity as well. I want to be a business owner. And we'll do what happens in a lot of countries, including the United States, quite frankly. The sort of the capitalist economic order is off the table. Nobody's talking about, at the elite level, nobody's talking about reforming it. And the people that are talking about reforming it are being framed as thugs and getting beaten up and arrested and tortured right now in Egypt. And I just think that's a tragedy.
Why do you think that's going to be off the table, though? I mean, that's what I don't get. Is why you think that particular thing is going to be off the table? Because it seems to me that that's going to be on the table. That's going to be something that people are going to mobilize around.
Well, I think it's on the table in the sense of sort of in the way you talk about, which is right, which is through elections you'll have politicians and parties that are going to raise those issues about economic reform to mobilize the constituency. And you do that, you have that in the United States. You have that all over the place. People and fundamentally the functioning of the country, if those in power, including the military, which I'm glad you mentioned, the military has substantial, financial holdings. It doesn't want its wealth taken away from it. It doesn't want its holdings taken away from it either. So I think the sort of big players that are supporting the revolution right now are supporting it because they know that their financial stakes are not really going to be at risk. I think you're right, economically something is going to change, but I think the substantial change we're going to see is at the political level and not at the economic level. And I don't think you're going to see a drop in unemployment. You're going to want those foreign aid to come in, and the foreign aid is often contingent. I mean, look even Obama's speech. On one hand, it's like, oh, we're for democracy and reform in the region, and it's a new game. Everything's changed. And in the next breath, it's like, well, nothing's changed. More IMF-style, aid packages and debt relief of $1 billion. Are you kidding me? I mean, that's nothing.
Right. Right, but here's my take, and here's where my fundamental right wing sympathies and inclinations come out.
Oh, I was hoping to provoke you.
Yeah. In the end, you knew you couldn't help that. That I'm not sure that there is an option for an Egypt, perhaps even a Tunisia, in the current world economic system, for them to pursue the kind of more statist and social welfare policies that characterized the Bourguiba years in Tunisia back in the 50s and 60s, that characterized the Nasser years of the late 50s into the 70s in Egypt. They just don't. I don't think they have the capital. I don't think they have the money to bring back those kinds of very heavily statist, pretty decent kind of social welfare. Establishing floors under which people wouldn't fall. Do you think that can be sustained in?
I don't think that's the only alternative, a statist view. I think the sort of large state welfare state, state control. I'm talking about if you have a massive redistribution of land in Egypt, where people are in control of parcels of lands that are more than adequate, not only to feed themselves but to have a share in selling it in your local markets as well. That would be a fundamental reform that it doesn't require. It would take a statist move to manage the land redistribution, but once it's managed, there's no reason that it would have to be this massive statist project. Because I agree, a massive statist project isn't viable and hasn't been successful, and so I'm not hopeful for that. But I think there's a lot of other alternatives besides the sort of massive statism versus the sort of destructive neoliberalism.
Right. So, but that would mean taking land in Egypt. I don't know Tunisia as well, but taking land in Egypt, not so much away from the old landholders that we all talk about in our classes and read about in the pre-revolutionary period, the families that own tens of thousands of acres, right? Because the Egyptian land reform of the 1950s did succeed, right, in breaking up a lot of those big land holdings, and it established, what our colleague Leonard Binder in his book on Egyptian politics called kind of a middle bourgeoisie, right, of agricultural owners. So can you take land away from them? I mean, they're the ones who say we're the ones who benefited from the original revolution in 1952, and we're not fat cats, we're not exploiters. But you're going to take my 100 acres, my 100 fidans. A fidan is about an acre of land. You're going to take my 100 fidans away and
I might, Greg. I might.
Really?
Do you know why? Because it's a revolution. It's a radical, fundamental reordering of the state and society and economic relations, and there might be a way in which you're just going to have to lose some of it.
Wow. So you would have to get, that would be unusual, because to have a democracy and a state that's willing to go in and take away upper middle class people's stuff, that would be really unusual historically, wouldn't it?
It would be unusual historically. I mean, there may be cases that aren't coming to mind, but this is why I'm pessimistic about there being a fundamental economic restructuring, because the elites aren't going to allow that to happen easily, and there's a lot of wealth in a lot of different hands. Military, all kinds of elites, including these families, that are going to say no way if that's what it comes to, and that's why I'm pessimistic that we'll see an economic restructuring, but why I'm optimistic that you might actually see real democracies emerge, because that's a way to channel those debates about economics into slow-moving institutions, which is, of course, what conservatives would like. End the revolutionary moment as soon as possible, because the grind of routine politics is very slow, and you can prevent major reforms from happening. And that's why I would like to actually. I'm very happy there's people still on the streets, still pushing and protesting, making demands on the state and on the army in Egypt and elsewhere, because I think the longer that's open, the more positive and fundamentally different the outcome is going to be. As soon as that's closed, as soon as we're only talking about is it proportional representation system or is it redistricting, as soon as that happens, yes, I think we'll see some kind of substantive democratic government emerge with all kinds of other issues just off the table. And I think, it's better than what was there, and I hope it for the whole region, but it really is less than might be possible in a revolutionary moment.
And I guess my different take on it is that if we do get these elections, which I think in Tunisia and Egypt we will, I don't think you can keep these hard economic issues off the table, and that might be the occasion for a real counter-revolutionary movement in these places. But we've kind of disparaged.
I hope you're right.
Yeah. We've kind of disparaged the electoral, the tinkering with electoral mechanics. But let me ask you, because these are issues in Tunisia and Egypt now, right? There are all sorts of people who are identified with the liberals, the youth, the kids from Tahrir, right? Who are now talking about wanting to postpone the elections. But you've got the Muslim Brotherhood saying, look, we had a referendum. 75%, roughly 75% of the people who voted in that referendum said that we should have the parliamentary elections in September. So, I mean, can you postpone elections in having had a vote in Egypt for 75, where 75% of the people said, yeah, let's have them in September?
That's a great question. I mean, can you? Of course you can, but I mean, you risk the process being viewed as, more and more illegitimate. But I mean, the concern right now is, as with the elections being, soon after the month of Ramadan, when the Muslim Brotherhood has historically high levels of support, competing, I mean, already has, it's established social basis throughout the country, and these new parties just trying to get going. It's not an easy thing to do quickly, let alone build a constituency. The reality is, while it would be hard to delay it, while it would be hard to explain, the reality is it might not be a fair fight if it happens in mid-September.
I have to say, I don't think it's ever going to be a fair fight. I think the Brotherhood has it all over these guys. I think in terms of organizational strength, in terms of discipline, in terms of mobilizational capacity. I mean, I think we saw that in the referendum. I mean,
I do too, but I mean, don't you think there's some pretty serious divides within the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in particular that might not be able for the group to make go away?
It's an interesting phenomenon. We're seeing splits everywhere. The liberals are split as usual. Among everybody and his cousin wants to have a political party. It's actually quite depressing if you wish the liberals in Egypt well that they can't get their act together. But these splits in the Brotherhood, we don't know, because we're going to see a free election in Egypt, which is the first time since 1952, since the revolution. So we have no idea what's going to happen. My guess, though, is that the Brotherhood is a little bit like the Hotel California, right? You can check out, but you can never leave. And that when these guys finally get into Parliament, they'll come back together because they actually do share a lot of common interests and they share a view of what Egyptian society should be like. And we'll see. It's funny that we're seeing kind of the opposite in Tunisia, right? Where it's the Islamist party, the Nahda party, the Renaissance party of Rashid al-Ghannouchi, who has now left the commission that was going to form the electoral law and oversee the elections, and they're complaining that the secularists have basically cut them out. Whereas in Egypt, we're seeing the more, if you want, the liberal secularists saying, oh, the Brotherhood and the army are trying to cut us out. So it is interesting that in every country we're seeing kind of different takes on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really important point to stress, is that, you're not seeing a single, Muslim Brotherhood phenomenon that's going to sweep the region. And certainly, if and when, I'll keep my fingers crossed, Yemen and Syria actually see, some kind of competitive elections emerge, you're not going to see the Muslim Brotherhood behaving the same in those countries. But I mean, in Tunisia, Nahda, which is the party of the Muslim Brotherhood, effectively has been out of the country. It has some support base, but it's not as established with on the ground offices and provision of services, all working for decades the way you have in Egypt. And I think so. It's kind of a different game for the Muslim Brotherhood there. And I think they are feeling very frustrated in Tunisia in that regard.
We've been talking about what might be the optimistic cases on the prospects for democracy, even though we have varying levels of optimism about them. Let's talk about, you mentioned Yemen. Let's talk about the places where fighting is still going on. And I'll throw this out in kind of a bald-faced way. Basically, I don't think that you can have democracy, a stable, functioning democracy in either Syria or Yemen, or Libya these days, given the amount of bloodshed, given the intensity of identity political issues in these places, whether it be tribalism in Yemen or sectarianism in Syria or regionalism in Libya. It seems to me that that if you get elections in these places, they're going to be like the early elections in Iraq after our invasion of Iraq. They're basically just going to be like taking a census, and it's going to divide more than unite people, and it's going to be messy. So tell me why I'm wrong on that.
Well, I mean, you're right. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be messy. Let's take Yemen for an example, though. I mean, I think Yemen's biggest obstacle to democracy is its neighbor to the east, is Saudi Arabia. It does not want to see a democracy in Yemen. And, we know from
to the east, to the north, its neighbor all around.
Yeah, exactly. Its neighbor all around, except for the sea. Doesn't want to see democracy. And we know from, the 90s and Yemen's unification in 1990, brought in 1993, this incredibly, diverse, interesting elections where nobody won a majority, and the largest bloc in the assembly were independents, and everyone was like, "Oh my goodness, how did this happen? Yemen, these people can handle democracy and campaign and get out there." And I think, the sort of risk of those divides, which are serious, sort of tribalism of parts of the country, which I think is overblown, quite frankly. But the sort of divided part of the country, the word is sort of different locales of authority, might actually be able to work for Yemen to have a democracy. We saw 20 years ago that it was able to happen very quickly, and there's no reason to think it couldn't happen again. The question is, whether the agreement among the elites is that some kind of democracy is better to some alternative. I think there's actually a good chance that could be a better alternative for some of them than deciding on a new Ali Abdullah Saleh. Who's going to be the new guy? Is Ali Mohsin? I mean, are people really going to feel confident in a single, elite or family, controlling the whole country? Because as we know, Saleh didn't actually control the country quite well.
For sure.
And so, I mean, I think in an odd way, everybody focuses on like Yemen as a potential failed state, which it certainly is. But, it actually could work to its advantage in a way that, some kind of limited democratic representative system might actually work well for it. And, if you remember sort of historically in Europe, a lot of the early democracies were bringing people from different power centers to the table to deliberate. And so if it's something of that level, there's no reason to think that couldn't, be a framework that could come into place and be quite stable. And so I want to be cautiously optimistic for Yemen. Certainly know the Yemeni people deserve to have a lot better than they've had in recent decades. But I mean, I think the biggest problem is Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's because Yemenis couldn't come up with it or handle it or support it. Culturally, normatively, etc. I think we've seen that it can. I think Saudi Arabia is going to prevent that from happening by funding everybody, all the opposition groups, as it has pretty consistently.
Yeah, I have a different take on Yemen. I actually think that Saudi Arabia, without a doubt, is the most important external actor in Yemen, and it would not be particularly helpful to democratic development. No question about that. We agree there. But I think that it's a mistake to say the Saudis can put a stop to it. Look, the Saudis couldn't put a stop to unity in 1990, which they had opposed for decades.
Yes.
And I see the breakdown in Yemen in the early 90s as less because of what the Saudis did and more because, frankly, I think the 93 elections were fixed. I mean, I think they were fixed against the Southerners, against the Socialist Party. I think Islah, the Reform Party, the Islamist Party in Yemen, and the governing party of Ali Abdullah Saleh basically divvied up the seats, and they cut out the Socialists. And then the Socialists said, well, the heck with that. We're going to go back to being independent. And you had the little civil war in 1994.
But I don't think it was a manipulation of the elections. I think, Ali Abdullah Saleh's massive assassination campaign against Southern leaders was, the real obstacle. And so I think, the evidence is that the elections were quite genuine in terms of the distribution of seats. But I think in terms of, why it didn't go forward. I guess my point is that there's no reason to think Yemenis can't handle or don't want a democratic government.
Right. And I would never say that anybody couldn't handle or wouldn't want a democratic government. And my point about the earlier elections in Yemen is not that they stuffed the ballot box, but more that the two of the three parties basically had a pre-electoral arrangement as to how they would divvy up the seats in the areas where they were strong that cut out the third party. And, theoretically, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in democracies, there are electoral alliances between various groups. But the third party in the case of Yemen, the Socialist Party from the south, thought that they were getting sidelined. And then you're right. I mean,
they were subject to assassination. Exactly.
They were being sidelined, and not just in the electoral process. So,
exactly.
Okay, right. But do you think that the fighting in Yemen, the violence in Yemen, that it's relatively easy to get beyond that? Because I wonder, given the violence in Yemen right now, if we're not seeing perhaps a return to a southern secessionist movement. And if you have a secessionist movement, right, you're not going to have a democratic process in the country as a whole until you decide what the boundaries of the country are. And if Southerners, if the Southern secession movement says, this is our chance, things are chaotic in Sana'a, we've got to go for it now, it seems to me that puts on hold any kind of democratic possibilities, even in a post-Saleh environment.
Yeah, I think it would put the democratic possibilities on hold. Without a doubt. And you might see that. But I think the prospects for some kind of representative government to come out of Yemen aren't as close to nil as a lot of people think. So I guess that's the way I would want to qualify it.
Yeah, and I guess they're closer to nil. I guess my take is they're closer to nil. How about another place where lots of people think that the prospects are pretty close to nil, and that's Syria? I mean, the thing Syria's got going for it, of course, is that it's a relatively educated population. And if we take kind of the classic indicators of what you need for stable democracy, at least many of the people who have studied democracy seem to think educational levels help. What's your take on Syria?
Well, I don't know. I've been watching videos of people in the street and some of the ways in which, they're critiquing the regime. And, it's kind of intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I mean, what's amazing about Syria, I think, different from Yemen and Tunisia and Egypt, and let's bracket for a moment the outcomes of those protests. But what's amazing about Syria is Syria has no history of protest. I mean, nothing has been acceptable for the regime. In Egypt, there's a long history of protests. Tunisia, much, much less, but there were still a lot of activities that were, allowed to happen here and there. In Egypt, there's tons of protests. I mean, the government doesn't tolerate everything, but there's certain, places and things you can do that are generally okay. In Syria,
without getting shot,
Yeah, exactly, without getting shot. If you were in certain locales and you didn't march too many people in too many places or say the wrong slogans, it was okay. And that was kind of a way that the government allowed things to happen and was probably smart for the regime for a little while. In Syria, nothing was acceptable. So anyone on the street protesting is violating the accepted script of what you can do in protest. Right. And so in some ways, I think what's happening in Syria is so much more extraordinary. I don't want to say more extraordinary because, one can't really compare. But they're staying out there. You're hearing a bit happening. I mean, a lot has been made of, I'm not a Syria specialist, but a lot has been made of, the fact that the protests haven't spread to Damascus or Aleppo yet. And, there's little rumblings in Aleppo, nothing major yet. But, I think it's a matter of time before they spread. And if they, people are, staying out there, they have martyrs now that people are rallying behind. The government has shown a real willingness to repress very harshly and, kill a lot of people. And it's not sending people off the streets. And so I think, if this goes on for a few more months, it could quite possibly, spread. The key thing when we study revolutions, one of the things we know typically is the big change happens when the military is divided. So I think this is one of the areas, we might disagree on a bit, but I think the writing's on the wall for a lot of these regimes. Like, nothing is off the table for me. They're looking around, they're panicking. They're like, what are we going to do? And so far, the Alawis seem to be somewhat sticking together in Syria, but why should we expect that family to stick together? If, generals in the army start looking around saying, okay, we can scapegoat the president, as long as, economic interests remain and we get to stay and we'll just back off, we'll play kind of Egypt kind of role, this sort of great overseer of some kind of, political change. I think you could see that. I mean, it's not irrelevant that in Yemen that Ali Mohsen is from the, same family as Ali Abdullah Saleh. So, I think there's a possibility with Syria that particularly if given what else is happening in the region, some people in the Alawi elite see the writing on the wall and decide to take a risk and split. I think you could see, significant change happening in Syria in the next few months.
Well, I certainly think you're right that looking at the military is absolutely key to all of these cases. In fact, I think that one of the lessons that I, as somebody who studies the Middle East, have taken from all of these events is that, we haven't looked at the military much as scholars. That was a topic for the past, right? Mm-hmm. The books we read when we were in graduate school, there was a lot of stuff on the military and politics because there had been all these military coups in the Arab world in the 50s and 60s. Right. And then it kind of fell out because we had these relatively stable regimes, right? And the military seemed to go back to the barracks or seemed to have an accepted place in politics, and everything seemed to be, and was, at the regime level, fairly stable. And now we're having upheaval, and we're seeing the militaries react differently in different places. And the quality of these militaries is very different, from very professional militaries in Tunisia and Egypt that could kind of define their own interests separate from the regimes and see a future for themselves, even if the head of the regime was replaced. But I see Syria in a really different way, because the army in Syria is not just a personalist army of the Assad family, the way the army in Yemen was kind of a personalist army of the Ali Abdullah Saleh family, and the army split when things got bad, right? Saleh's family members sticking with him, and more ambitious non-family members like General Ali Mohsen, who you mentioned, splitting off. You see the army in Libya splitting because it was a personal army for Gaddafi. But in Syria, it seems to me, it's not the personal army of the Assad family. It, in fact, is the army of the Alawi minority. And we should say, for listeners who maybe aren't as geeky about the Middle East as Jillian and I are, the Alawis are a small, about 10, maybe 10, 11, 12% of the Syrian population. They're a branch of Shiism. The vast majority of Syrians are Sunni Muslims. The French occupiers privileged the Alawi minority and recruited them into military formations, and thus they were overrepresented in the officer corps. And when these military coups in Syria started in 1949 through the last one in 1970 that brought Hafez al-Assad to power, you see the Alawis concentrating power much more in their hands to a greatly disproportionate amount of in comparison to their population. So that's the brief lecture on who the Alawis are. Now back to the story. Right? These guys, I think it would be really tough for them to separate from the regime, to say we can throw Assad over and still think that we can maintain our position and privileges in a post-Assad, more open, more democratic Syria. Because I think that the sectarian element there is a lot stronger. I think that the notion, if I put myself in the shoes of some of these Alawi generals, and I say to myself, my God, if we abandon Assad, these people in the street will think they have us on the ropes, and they will just come after us even harder. And that this will bring down the entire structure of power which allowed our small, relatively downtrodden minority historically in Syria to get to this position of privilege. And it seems to me that if that's the way the generals think, we could be in for a very bloody time in Syria.
We could. Well, I think we're in for a very bloody time, even if some of them don't think that way. If somebody does decide to split off, I mean, I think we're in for a bloody time. But I don't know. It only takes one or two who start to say, you know what, we're doubling down and going to try to preserve everything. We want nothing to change. We're going to try to preserve the entire regime, the entire power structure. Is this viable for, 6 months, 6 years, or a couple decades? I mean, maybe this is the moment to accept less, but to keep most. Sort of say we're going to let go of a little bit. But I mean, it just takes one or two to split off to really be a game changer.
But your point is that once that happens, the regime falls.
No, but that it's possible for the regime to fall. I think I'm just sort of, challenging the idea that the Alawis are never going to split because they all have the same interest together. I think they do have a lot of interest together, but I think there's, especially because, this isn't a revolution in isolation. This is looking around the region. I think, you don't know that everybody has the same toleration for this to go on for the long term. I mean, you might have some that are like, you know what, we're going to split and be the heroes and hope for the best. And hopefully these people will look kindly on the fact that we were the one that broke apart the military, and we'll be the heroes of the revolution. And we're going to have less than we have now, but we're going to have something, because we're going to risk, not having anything if this goes on. I mean, I'm not sure that that's what's going to happen, obviously, but I just think it's more of a possibility than some. I mean, the notion of sectarian divides get, made into this, sort of exaggerated into, nothing can crack this.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of cracks. I think it's holding together, and I think it's going to hold together for a while. I think there's a better than nil possibility that it could crack. And that's why, you might be right. We've seen the crest in the region, but I think there's a lot of places where there's possibilities for things to still kind of split wide open. And I'm, quite frankly, hoping for that, as you probably are too.
No, actually, not so much.
Okay.
My right wing innate conservatism says revolution bad. Let's not have any more. And that's not even talking about American policy, which we haven't mentioned at all. And I think that's a refreshing thing, because, frankly, I think that the U.S. it's not irrelevant, but it's marginal to a lot of the things that are going on. It's not marginal in Libya because we're bombing them, but and any hope of getting rid of Gaddafi obviously has rested on outside power interference there.
Do you think it's marginal to Yemen too?
I think so.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, you can't either sustain or change a political system with predator drones.
You can sustain instability with predator drones. I don't think the drone attacks are doing anything to improve the situation there. So
but
in a sense, we're a player in continuing to have it be pretty bad.
Yeah, but I also don't think that the predator drones are either helping Saleh or helping his opponents. Or I mean, yeah, they're contributing to instability. But as you say, Yemen is a pretty unstable place even before the upheavals of the last 7 months. It seems to me that if we were giving Ali Abdullah Saleh lots of money, like we were, right, to build up his forces, and in that sense, we have had an effect, because we gave him a lot of money to build up certain forces that he put his sons and his nephews in charge of, and now those are the forces that are supporting him. Without a doubt, we played a role there. But in terms of the current dynamic of Ali Abdullah and his son and his nephews versus Ali Muhsin versus the Al Ahmar tribal leaders versus the Southerners versus the Houthis, all of these parties that are at play in Yemen, it seems to me that we're not playing a big role. We, the United States, are not playing a big role, and to me that's just fine. I mean, I think that our intervention in the politics of the Arab world has mostly been negative and has led to all sorts of unintended consequences. And so I think
we'll completely agree on that. I mean, I think the best prospects for things to change in the region are the cases where we stay as far away from them as possible.
Yeah, and I think that one of the problems frankly, with the Obama administration and the people in it, as much as I admire the president on many things, is that their impulse is we should do something. We should do something to help these people. And I think that we would all be better off, including from my understanding of American interests. And you and I think on some of these things might have a different take on what America's overall interests are. But that's something we can chat about in another Blogging Heads maybe someday.
Okay.
That from different points we're kind of on the same place, that these events in the Arab world are something that the United States should take some distance from, rather than get really, really involved in. But tell me, right. and we'll have to wrap this up pretty soon, I think. Tell me why you think that the U.S. is playing a more important role in Yemen.
Well, I don't think it's playing an important role in a a positive sense. I mean, I don't think
No,
it's,
but in any sense at all, that we're affecting things in Yemen.
I think, like, so if you take the case of Egypt, one of the signals that's been sent is, focus on, the political process reform, and we're going to continue to support you and prop up the economic reform. And, the language there is sort of to echo what I said before was, that the administration, the people in it genuinely believe that they're taking a different tack towards the region. In a lot of ways they are. And I think that's important to acknowledge that they're trying to do something that deviates from what's been done in the past. And in a lot of ways they are doing stuff that deviates from what's in the past. But, when they talk about economic reforms, this is coming from the administration, the talk is about, we want to help the man on the street. We'll help them do what? We'll help them be an entrepreneur to also, get on board with this, the economic vision we have. It's not about
globalization.
Yeah, well, a particular kind of globalization. Globalization doesn't have to mean, neoliberal economic globalization. Globalization can mean interconnectedness. It can mean free trade. It can mean all kinds of things. Free trade isn't the same as this sort of the kinds of policies where there's deep foreign investment, a reliance on remittances and reliance on rents in terms of foreign aid and IMF kinds of packages. And so, I think that the U.S. is, I think you're right. I think that they have this impulse to do something. And they have the right impulse, which is what we've done in the past hasn't been the right thing, and we need to do the right thing. And we're just not sure what the right thing is. And I commend it for recognizing that. But I think you're right. It has this impulse to, we need to do something. We need to help. We can't just stand by. And it doesn't really know how to imagine what it's doing in a different sense. And, I think the less is more in these cases.
Yeah, and on that note, I think we probably should bring this to a close. We've gone over a bunch of stuff and then ended up on some U.S. policy, and it's been a lot of fun. So thanks very much, Jillian, and thanks very much for everybody who watched.
Great. Thank you, Greg, and thank you for everyone for watching.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.